Have you ever lived next to someone who treated you like they owned the entire neighborhood? For Mr. Marcus Bell, a quiet man, devoted teacher, his small home was the only place he could return to for peace after long hours in the classroom. But when his neighbor, Celeste Vanderholt, decided she had the right to block his driveway again and again, he remained patient, until patience was mistaken for weakness and silence became a reason to be trampled on. Then one day, Mr. Bell decided he wouldn't step back anymore. This story began with a single car being towed and ended with the fall of a self-proclaimed queen of a community where no one dared to speak the truth, until now. Some things in life start out small, so small that if you're not paying attention, they're easy to overlook. But sometimes it's the smallest things that spark a fire you simply can't put out. It was Monday morning in the quiet suburb of Lakeland, Florida. As the sun rose gently over the neighborhood, Mr. Marcus Bell wheeled his car out of the garage, preparing for another day of teaching. A man in his early 50s, Marcus lived by routine and order, much like the classic poems he taught his students. Every morning unfolded like a well-written paragraph. Coffee, the morning paper, then off to class. But that morning, the rhythm was broken by a single, seemingly small detail. A silver Lexus RX was parked squarely across his driveway. It wasn't his. It didn't belong to a friend or any colleague he knew. It just sat there boldly, as if his driveway were public property. Marcus stood for a moment, still holding his coffee. He assumed it was a mistake, maybe someone visiting a neighbor, not paying attention to where they'd parked. Annoyed but composed, he carefully backed his car out, maneuvering around it. He didn't like to make a fuss. A literature teacher for nearly 30 years, Marcus had learned that patience was the strongest tool for keeping bitterness at bay. But when it happened again the next day and the day after that, his patience began to wear thin. On the third day, Marcus rang the doorbell next door. The door swung open, revealing Celeste Vanderholt, a middle-aged woman with pale blonde hair, dressed in designer yoga wear. She smiled politely, though her demeanor was distant. She lived alone and was well known in the neighborhood association. She seemed like someone who wasn't used to being questioned. "Oh, I was just visiting a friend for a minute," she said, smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. The delivery truck needed space to turn around. Marcus nodded politely. "I understand, but this is my driveway. I need it clear when I come home." Celeste smiled again, but her eyes flicked past him, as if to say he was overreacting. "Of course, I'll be more mindful, so sorry." But the apology never came with a change in behavior. In the days that followed, the Lexus returned like a quiet insult, over and over again. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't tape angry notes to the windshield like some might have. He simply observed, took note, and continued parking at the curb. But something in Celeste's eyes that day, the way she smiled as if to say, "You won't do anything about it," planted a different kind of thought in his mind. He didn't like confrontation, but he also didn't accept prolonged disrespect, especially not on the doorstep of the place he called home. And so, a story began, not with a fight, not with a threat, but with a quiet glance, a calm reply, and a silent decision made deep within. Because sometimes, the way you respond to disrespect isn't in what you say, it's in the moment you choose to stop staying silent. 3 days after that first knock, Marcus Bell came home later than usual. A long parent-teacher conference had dragged on into twilight. The 50-year-old literature teacher was tired, his shirt collar wrinkled after a full day of listening to concerns, complaints, and the occasional flicker of hope from anxious parents. All he wanted was a clean driveway, a hot cup of tea, and a quiet evening spent grading papers. But that hope was crushed by a now all-too-familiar sight. Celeste Vanderholt's sleek silver Lexus RX parked squarely across his driveway. Again, no note, no courtesy call, just a silent display of arrogance. Marcus exhaled. There was no misunderstanding this time. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice, one rooted in disregard. He didn't go inside right away. Instead, he quietly opened his trunk, pulled out a piece of cardboard, and a thick black marker. His handwriting was not angry, but it was firm and unmistakably clear. "Please do not park here. This is private property. Repeat violations will be dealt with accordingly." He slid the note beneath her windshield wiper and walked inside. The next morning, when Marcus stepped outside, the note was gone. But the Lexus? Still there. No words were needed. The silence said it all. She didn't care. The following day, Marcus tried calling the neighborhood management board. On the other end, a woman answered in a flat, almost robotic tone. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bell. Unless there's physical damage or clear evidence of trespassing, we can't intervene in neighbor disputes." "Even if she regularly parks in my driveway?" Marcus asked, still calm and polite. "Yes, unless you have security footage showing repeated violations," she replied. "We can send a courtesy email reminder, but we're limited beyond that." Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Thank you," he said. He wasn't surprised. Someone like Celeste, a familiar face on the neighborhood council, organizer of Christmas parties, speaker at resident meetings, wasn't likely to be held accountable, and complaints from a quiet literature teacher like him probably didn't carry much weight. But Marcus didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he quietly walked inside, opened his laptop, and typed into the search bar, "Private towing service, Lakeland." That afternoon, Celeste returned home and found her Lexus missing from Marcus's driveway. On her windshield was a neatly clipped white slip. "Your vehicle has been towed for unauthorized parking on private property. Please contact Sunshine Towing at phone number to retrieve your vehicle. Fees for towing and storage apply." From behind the curtain, Marcus stood silently. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. Just a quiet nod like a well-edited paragraph finally punctuated. Because patience has limits, and a polite reminder, when ignored too many times, eventually becomes action. The next morning, Marcus Bell brewed a cup of black tea, placed it on the windowsill, and settled into his familiar wooden chair. Even on weekends, he kept to his early rising routine. Outside, the sound of birds filled the garden, and the soft morning sun spilled across the porch. Everything was perfect. Except for one thing. Celeste Vanderholt. Her silver Lexus RX was back. Not in his driveway this time, but parked just along the edge of his lawn, hovering over the grass in a way that wasn't quite illegal, but also far from respectful. A quiet form of defiance, subtle, deliberate, and worse than the car was the attitude. Before 9 a.m., Marcus heard the sharp click-click of high heels approaching his front door. He didn't have to look to know who it was. Celeste, dressed once again in expensive yoga wear, a purple smoothie in hand, knocked on his door with the confidence of someone who thought they owned the entire neighborhood. When Marcus opened the door, she didn't even wait for a greeting. "Mr. Bell," she said, her tone sweet but tight with restrained annoyance. "We need to talk." "I take it you're here for your car?" Marcus asked, lifting his tea without breaking his calm. "No," she replied, raising an eyebrow. "I'm here to talk about the inconvenient little towing incident last night." "Inconvenient for whom, Ms. Vanderholt?" Marcus asked, still courteous. Celeste let out a sharp, amused breath as if he'd just told a joke. "For the whole neighborhood, if you must know. People are talking, Mr. Bell, about the English teacher who had his neighbor's car towed, as some sort of message." She emphasized the last words. Marcus set his tea down on the side table. "You parked in my driveway. I asked you not to more than once. I left notes, I made calls, and when that didn't work, I handled it, in the most lawful way possible." Celeste shook her head, her eyes gleaming with condescension. "Sometimes the law isn't the only thing that defines right and wrong, Mr. Bell. There's also community spirit, grace, and status. I'm not sure status gives anyone the right to commandeer someone else's property," Marcus replied, his voice dipping slightly, quieter but firmer. Celeste paused, then shifted tone suddenly. "Look, I understand that you might not be fully aware of how things work around here. But let me make it clear, I have connections to the HOA. I have influence. And you, well, you're new around here, aren't you?" Marcus smiled, just faintly. "I've lived here 12 years, Ms. Vanderholt. I may not show up at the HOA meetings, but I do know who reported my garden for being overgrown last summer." Celeste froze. "And I also know," Marcus continued, "who filed the complaint when my trash bin stayed on the curb for more than 15 minutes in April. Every time, the report came from one address, 238 Oakview Drive, yours." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Bell?" "No," Marcus said plainly. "I'm just returning what you've been giving attitude." The air between them thickened like morning fog. Celeste let out a sharp breath, turned, and walked away, heels clicking against the clean pavement, leaving faint marks behind. Marcus remained at the doorway, silent. He didn't want war with his neighbor. But politeness is not something to be trampled on, and it is certainly not a sign that he would bow forever. He stepped back inside, took a sip of now-cooled tea, On the table, the towing receipt from Sunshine Towing still lay where he'd left it, a quiet reminder that a step had been taken. But the game was just beginning. Monday morning. Marcus Bell walked into his office with a folder tucked under his arm, ready to begin a new week. Teaching had always been his sanctuary amid the noise of teenagers. He still felt he was planting something meaningful. But today, before the school bell even rang, a colleague leaned in and whispered, "Hey Marcus, what's going on at your place? People on the neighborhood council are talking." Marcus frowned. Talking about what? Something about you having a neighbor's car towed, stirring up trouble, making things difficult. The colleague lowered his voice, as if afraid to be overheard. Marcus simply shook his head. He didn't need to ask who started the rumors. Celeste Vanderholt. That afternoon, returning home, Marcus found something peculiar. A color-printed flyer taped to his front door. In bold letters, it read, "We live in a community, not a battlefield." No signature. No one claimed responsibility. But the tone spoke volumes. It could only have come from one person. Later that same day, an email from the neighborhood council was sent to all residents. Polite in language, but heavy with implication. "We encourage all residents to resolve conflicts in a friendly and civil manner. Coercive tactics disrupt the harmony of our community." Marcus let out a quiet, unimpressed laugh. Literature had taught him long ago. The most polite words often hide the sharpest intentions. 2 days later, a letter arrived in his mailbox. Official notice from the HOA, aesthetic violation. Claims that his fence was inconsistently painted and that his bougainvillea bush was at risk of encroaching on the sidewalk. Was this real? Marcus looked at the plant he'd cared for over 3 years, never once sighted. The first time he laughed. The second time he realized this wasn't coincidence. It was a tactic. Celeste's tactic. Turning rules into weapons. Twisting every small detail into a tool for pressure. Thursday afternoon. While watering his plants, a security patrol vehicle quietly pulled up. A young, tall officer with a serious demeanor stepped out. "Good evening, Mr. Bell. We received a report of suspicious activity near your property." Marcus set the watering can down. Suspicious activity? They didn't specify, just said someone unfamiliar was lingering around your home. Marcus glanced around. There was no one, just himself. The guard scratched his head, visibly embarrassed. "I'm sure it's nothing, but we're required to check." Marcus sighed. "It's all right, I understand. You're just doing your job." That night, he sat in the warm glow of his living room lamp. Opening his laptop, he scrolled down to a folder labeled simply, Vanderholt. Inside it, photos, video clips, the tow truck receipt, scanned copies of HOA warnings, screenshots of emails, everything filed with quiet precision. He wasn't keeping score with angry notes or raised voices. He was preparing. Because Marcus Bell wasn't the kind of man to play chess recklessly, he observed every move, and when the time came, he would checkmate without raising his voice. Celeste might think she was ahead, but what she didn't know was that Marcus had been preparing for the final move all along. The following Saturday, Marcus Bell woke up earlier than usual. The sky was clear, the breeze gentle. It was a perfect day to receive guests. His daughter and 2 grandkids were coming over, and in that quiet joy of family, all he wanted was a peaceful morning. A few simple dishes, chairs set out in the backyard, the sound of children laughing under the sun. That peace, however, lasted only until he stepped onto his front porch. There it was again. The white SUV Celeste Vanderholt's Range Rover. Parked squarely across his driveway, as if it had been hers all along. Not only did it block the entire entrance, it sat so close it obscured Marcus's mailbox. No warning sign, no explanatory message, just audacity. Marcus stood still for a few seconds. Not surprised, not angry, just confirmation. She had escalated the game, a declaration of open war on the very day she knew he was expecting family. He slipped his phone into his pocket. He didn't call her, didn't text. Instead, he walked inside, turned on his computer, and opened the folder labeled Vanderholt. 1 minute later, he was on the phone with his usual towing service, his voice calm and measured. "Same address as before, but this time I need it quick. I have company on the way." The dispatcher chuckled gently. "Ms. Vanderholt blocking your driveway again? Don't worry, Mr. Bell. Our truck's nearby. We'll be there in 15. This time, Marcus didn't wait inside. He pulled a chair onto the front porch, cup of coffee in hand, and beside it a printed full-color copy of his property deed, placed neatly on the table. He wasn't just responding, he was staging, as if preparing for a performance he'd written, directed, and now waited for the audience to unknowingly arrive. Exactly 15 minutes later, the hum of the tow truck arrived like the overture to a carefully composed act. The vehicle rolled to a stop in front of his driveway. The driver stepped out and gave a respectful nod. "This the one?" "That's her." In under 5 minutes, the Range Rover's wheels were strapped, its front end lifted, ready to leave. And then, almost like a scene rehearsed, Celeste appeared. She burst out of her house, hair wild, her face contorted in disbelief as she saw her beloved luxury SUV mid-air, with more than a few neighbors watching from their weekend strolls. "Stop! You can't touch my car!" she shrieked, storming toward the driver. Marcus remained seated, eyes casually scanning the newspaper in his lap. But when he heard the sound of angry heels approaching, he rose slowly, still holding his coffee, and pointed at the document on the table. "Your vehicle is parked on land I own. This is the legal proof. I don't need another explanation." Celeste's jaw clenched. "I was expecting company. No one else on this street has a problem. Why are you making this such a big deal?" Marcus offered a gentle smile, his voice calm as ever. "Because you don't understand the difference between sharing and taking." The tow truck pulled away with her SUV, taking with it the frayed edges of her inflated power. The neighbors stayed still. Some feigned watering plants, others pretended to check their mail, but none walked away. Maybe, just maybe, they too were beginning to realize that the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was no longer in control. Back inside, Marcus didn't return to his seat. Instead, he picked up his phone and opened a new file. Statement to the Neighborhood Council. He began to type, time, location, details complete with time-stamped photos. This was no longer a war of words. This was now a battleground of facts, and he would fight it the way only someone like him could, with restraint, with clarity, and with the unshakable confidence of a man who knew the law, understood boundaries, and would defend what was his without ever raising his voice. 3 days after the towing incident, Celeste Vanderholt walked into the neighborhood council meeting as if nothing had happened. Same expensive cream-colored dress, same neatly curled hair, same rehearsed social smile. But this time, that smile couldn't quite mask the flicker of unease in her eyes, because deep down, she knew things were slipping out of her control. Marcus Bell was there too for the first time since moving into the neighborhood. He sat near the front, a dark brown folder clutched in his hands. No greetings, no small talk, just quiet, measured observation, as though waiting for the next move in a chess match already mapped out in his mind. The meeting started like any other. Budget reports, maintenance updates, a few reminders. Then the chair, Gerard Livingston, a shrewd, silver-haired man in his 60s, looked up from his notes and tapped his pen gently on the mic. There have been several formal complaints submitted by residents regarding inappropriate behavior by a sitting council member. The air in the room shifted. Celeste sat upright, her posture perfect, but her hands had started to grip each other tightly in her lap. Gerard continued. The complaint was filed by Mr. Marcus Bell. The supporting documents include photographs, notes, copies of warnings, and official communications with the towing service. The entire room seemed to turn toward Marcus. For the first time, the stares he received were not indifferent or dismissive, but attentive, serious. Marcus stood up and walked calmly to the podium. No nervousness, no anger, just quiet, steady resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," he began, his voice calm and clear. "I'm not here to start conflict. I'm here to protect the most basic right a homeowner has, the right to use their own property without being harassed." He opened his folder and pulled out a neat stack of papers. "I've documented at least 11 instances where Ms. Vanderholt parked illegally in my driveway, despite multiple polite requests to stop. When I escalated the issue through the proper channels, I received no resolution. Instead, I became the target of false accusations." A few council members began whispering. Gerard nodded for him to continue. "I'm not asking for Ms. Vanderholt to be embarrassed in front of this community. But I cannot accept that someone thinks they can wield their position on this council as a weapon to intimidate, retaliate, or punish others simply for not accommodating them." He paused, letting his eyes rest for a moment on Celeste's pale, speechless face. "I've also submitted evidence of abuse of authority, misuse of the neighborhood patrol, anonymous complaints sent through council email, and most recently, the theft of my trash can." A chuckle escaped from someone in the audience. The room stirred with murmurs. Celeste flushed, standing halfway out of her chair before Gerard raised his hand. "Order, please. This is a serious matter." He turned to Celeste. "Ms. Vanderholt, do you have a response to these allegations?" She pressed her lips together, trying to maintain composure, but the cracks were showing. I was simply enforcing the guidelines. Mr. Bell has been uncooperative from the beginning, and I have a question," another council member interrupted. "Can you explain why you used the council's official email address to send anonymous criticism targeting Mr. Bell personally?" She didn't answer. The room fell silent again. Marcus returned to his seat. He said nothing further. He didn't need to. Everything necessary had been spoken through reason, facts, and undeniable proof. As the meeting ended, a soft-spoken elderly woman, Mrs. Thelma, approached Marcus, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "We've been watching this unfold for a while," she said softly. "Thank you for standing up. I think this is the first time someone's called her out publicly." Marcus smiled, his expression steady. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to say, "Enough." And he knew. Whatever came next, he was no longer alone in this quiet war. Just days after the neighborhood council meeting, signs of a quiet shift began spreading through Willow Springs. People talked less, watched more. The whispers followed every step Celeste Vanderholt took once the face of local authority, now a name that conjured up memories of arrogance and abuse of power. But anyone who thought Celeste would give up easily clearly didn't know her. On Tuesday morning, Marcus Bell was enjoying a cup of herbal tea in his living room, winding down after an online literature class, when he noticed a letter slipped under his door. No postage, no return address, just, "To Mr. Bell, urgent." He opened it. Inside, a printed email titled, "Proposal to review Marcus Bell's standing within Willow Springs community." The sender? A generic name, Community Representative, signed only with the initial C. The content accused Marcus of causing division, fostering a hostile atmosphere, and undermining the sense of safety among certain members of the council. At the end, it proposed a temporary suspension of his voting rights in neighborhood meetings. Marcus smirked. He knew exactly who was behind it. Less than an hour later, his phone rang. On the line was Mrs. Thelma, his elderly neighbor and quiet ally. "Mr. Bell," she said, "I just got a copy of that letter. No one's buying it. That stunt is older than my begonias." Marcus's voice was calm. "But she still thinks power is her shield." Thelma sighed. "I called a couple of people on the board. They said it's being officially reviewed, but you should know she's collecting signatures. To try and push me out of the neighborhood? Not explicitly, but pretty much. She's calling it preserving the image of the community." Marcus paused. Then he said, "Then maybe it's time we shine a little light into the corners." That afternoon, Marcus stepped out of his house, a thick file tucked under his arm. He didn't go to the council office. He didn't knock on every door like a campaigner. He simply strolled down the street slowly, deliberately right as neighbors were watering plants, picking up kids from school, or sipping coffee on their porches. He stopped by familiar homes, people who had witnessed Celeste's behavior firsthand. They looked at him cautiously at first, but then listened. And when he laid out the evidence, photos, notes, emails, they nodded. Some were silent. Some confessed their own stories. They had endured quietly, out of fear, but they hadn't forgotten. That evening, a new thread appeared on the Willow Springs Community Forum. On the unethical conduct of council member Celeste Vanderholt, documentation and testimonies. Author, Marcus Bell. Attached was a respectful, detailed post, listing every known incident, anonymous complaint letters, misused security patrols, arbitrary citations, and interference with neighborhood policy, all backed by hard evidence. Within the hour, over 24 comments flooded in. Finally, someone had the guts to speak up. "She fined me $100 for planting the wrong flowers. Supporting Mr. Bell, enough is enough." About time this got out in the open, Celeste responded immediately with a comment in all caps. "Don't be misled, he's dividing this community." But instead of support, her comments sank buried beneath a rising tide of messages backing Marcus. The weight of truth was pressing down on the thin, cracking shell of power she'd once worn like armor. And this time, the silence that followed wasn't from fear. It was the sound of a community waking up. After Marcus Bell's post spread across Willow Springs' internal network, Celeste Vanderholt could no longer maintain the calm mask she'd worn for so long. The comments supporting Marcus, the familiar names once silent now speaking up, all of it made Celeste feel something she had never truly experienced before: isolation. But Celeste wasn't the type to surrender. She did what false power often does: retaliate. Just days later, an email was sent to all residents from the official community council inbox. Its subject line was short, but full of implication: violation of neighborhood conduct, disruptive behavior by Mr. Marcus Bell. The content detailed how a resident has repeatedly disseminated inflammatory content causing community distress and shared unverified information on the internal platform. It closed with a suggestion to consider suspending Mr. Bell's membership to preserve the peace and unity of the neighborhood. The email was signed Celeste Vanderholt, still referring to herself as vice chair of the council. Marcus read the email in his home office, a now cold cup of tea by his side. He wasn't surprised, nor was he angry, just a bit disappointed. Not because he was the target, but because Celeste still thought this was about power, when it had always been about truth and principle. And this time, she had made a critical mistake. By sending a personal accusation from the council's shared inbox, without vote or verification, Celeste had violated the operational code of the neighborhood committee. Marcus responded shortly after. No dramatic statements, no harsh words. Just a polite email, with a scanned copy of the council's bylaws attached highlighting the clause on use of shared resources for personal agendas and abuse of authority by council members. And one final line, precise and weighty: if necessary, I am willing to bring this to an emergency session. Within 24 hours, a special meeting was convened at the community center. What was striking wasn't that the meeting happened, but that it had been called by council members themselves, some of whom had once followed Celeste's lead. The room was packed. More than 30 residents showed up. Many of the faces were the same ones Marcus had quietly spoken to in recent days. They came because they'd had enough. Celeste entered the room composed on the surface, but her eyes no longer held that usual air of superiority. She sat across from Marcus, who remained calm, his usual folder in hand. Council Chair Walter, an older man with silver hair and a quiet authority, opened the meeting without ceremony. We've received a formal complaint regarding misuse of the council's email system. Ms. Vanderholt, do you have a statement? Celeste pressed her lips together and glanced around for support, but no eyes met hers. I only wanted to warn residents about misinformation spreading, she said weakly. Walter flipped through a document. Are you asserting that Mr. Bell's materials were false? Celeste hesitated. A yes meant she'd need to disprove every documented fact. A no would be an admission of guilt. She chose a third option, silence. But in that silence, her credibility collapsed. Another council member spoke up. I believe it's time we formally review Ms. Vanderholt's status on the council, given multiple breaches of conduct and her divisive role in this community. For the first time in years, no one objected. The meeting ended with a vote, 6 in favor, 1 abstention, 0 opposed. Celeste Vanderholt was officially suspended from the Willow Springs Neighborhood Council. Marcus said nothing more. He simply nodded to Walter, then quietly left the building. On his way home, he walked slowly, street lamps casting soft gold across the silver strands in his hair. He knew this battle was never about winning. It was about defending dignity, about proving that sometimes all it takes is one person standing up for an entire community to stop bowing down. Monday morning, a new dawn in Willow Springs. On Monday morning, following that fateful meeting, the atmosphere in the Willow Springs neighborhood became strangely lighter. Sidewalk conversations no longer carried tension. Exchanged glances, once filled with suspicion, now turned into nods of empathy. But for Celeste Vanderholt, that silence wasn't peace, it was a verdict. She had nearly vanished from everyone's sight. No longer did she appear with a coffee cup in hand along the walkway, nor did she offer trivial reminders like whose tree hasn't been trimmed properly, or house number 18's trash bin is out at the wrong time. Even her next-door neighbors hadn't seen her step outside. But that silence was merely the calm before the storm. 3 days later, an unexpected letter appeared in every Willow Springs resident's mailbox. Not an email, not an internal newsletter, but a printed letter, formal, with a red seal at the top corner. Urgent notice from McClellan and Partners Law Office. The content? Celeste Vanderholt officially filed a lawsuit against Marcus Bell and the Willow Springs Neighborhood Council, accusing them of defamation, damaging personal reputation, and invasion of privacy. The community was once again shaken. Marcus held the letter in his hand, reading each line with a calm gaze. No anger, no worry. He simply shook his head slightly, as if witnessing someone struggling in the very mire they had dug themselves. That evening, Walter, the council president, knocked on his door. "I know you don't need to hear this, but you're not alone in this," he said, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. "We've consulted the community lawyer, and you'll want to read this." In Marcus's hands were testimonies from over 20 residents, fully signed, detailing what they had endured from Celeste over the years. Instances of being threatened with fines for planting the wrong type of flowers, times when security was called just because their children played ball in the yard, unjustified surprise inspections early in the morning. Celeste thought she was suing one person, but she didn't anticipate that. This time, the entire community would stand together. The court date was set. Not a major trial, just a preliminary hearing to assess the legal validity of the lawsuit. But from early that morning, the small courtroom was packed. Willow Springs residents had gathered in unprecedented numbers. Celeste entered, noticeably gaunt. The cream-colored dress she once wore with pride now seemed out of place amidst the gazes that no longer held respect. Marcus sat quietly among the back rows. He hadn't come to win. He came to bring closure. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern gaze, flipped through the files, then gently tapped her gavel. After reviewing evidence from both sides and considering collective testimonies from residents, the court concludes that Mrs. Vanderholt's lawsuit lacks clear legal basis and is of a personal nature. The lawsuit is dismissed. All legal costs will be borne by the plaintiff. A soft sigh of relief echoed throughout the room, not because someone won, but because the truth had been rightfully restored. Celeste stood there, stiff as a statue. No one approached to console her. No one stood by her side anymore. She turned and left, her steps unsteady, the courtroom door closing behind her like the final slam of a concluded era. On the way home, Marcus Bell said nothing. He simply looked up at the clear autumn sky, the wind gently rustling through the leaves like whispers of gratitude from those who had never been heard. One early winter afternoon, pale sunlight stretched across the quiet rooftops of Willow Springs. On the wide lawn in front of the community house, rows of wooden chairs were neatly arranged. Over 30 residents had gathered, faces glowing with anticipation. Children played nearby, a few dogs lay calmly at their owners' feet. Today's atmosphere was markedly different from the tense meetings of previous months. In the small courtyard, Marcus Bell stood before a simple wooden podium, holding a stack of papers he didn't bother to look at. Because everything he was about to say, he had already memorized in his heart. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning each familiar face, those who had once been oppressed, once silent, and now stood tall. "I'm not standing here as a victor," he began, his voice calm, resonating just enough. "I'm standing here simply as a neighbor, like everyone else. Someone who once thought that staying silent was the best way to keep peace." He paused briefly. But sometimes, silence becomes the weapon that allows wrongdoing to grow stronger. Sometimes, we must stand up, not because we seek conflict, but because we need to protect what's right. All eyes turned toward him. Nods of agreement began to appear. We've lived too long under the control of one individual, someone who used rules as tools to assert power rather than to build community. But today, that ends not because of a towed car or a court session, but because of the unity of everyone here. Sometimes the strongest person is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who knows exactly when to stand up calmly, firmly, and with dignity. Mr. Marcus Bell didn't need revenge. He only needed the truth and determination to help the entire community see who was truly worthy of trust. And in the end, what he regained wasn't just his driveway, but the respect of his neighbors and the fairness that everyone deserves.